right, let's dive into one of history's biggest mysteries. It's the Dyatlov Pass Incident. We've got tons of research, articles, even first-hand accounts to sort through. We're going to see if, maybe we can finally figure out what happened to those 9 hikers back in '59.
It's crazy. Even with all the scientific discoveries we've made recently, there are still so many questions that are just unanswered. It's a story that's just captivated people for decades, and for good reason.
It really has. I mean, even the basic facts of the case are pretty scary. 9 experienced hikers just vanish in the Ural Mountains. They find their tent ripped open from the inside. And then, weeks later, their bodies show up scattered across the mountain. Some of them have really strange and brutal injuries.
And the official explanation was so vague, They said it was a compelling natural force. That just made everyone speculate even more.
It did. So we're not just looking at the science today. We're going to explore why people are still so fascinated by this mystery. Is it just the unanswered questions? Or is there something more?
Well, to understand, we need to go back to the beginning. It's February 1959. The Cold War is in full swing. This group, mostly students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, set out to climb these icy peaks in the Ural Mountains. And remember, this was the Soviet Union. They were super secretive back then. Adds another layer to everything.
They were experienced hikers, though, right? They weren't just some random group of people wandering into the wilderness unprepared.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They were skilled, well-equipped. They knew how to handle winter trekking. They were even trained in first aid and, what to do in emergencies. But even being prepared can't save you from everything, as we're going to see.
That's for sure. So they reached the slopes of this mountain, Kholat Shakel. It's known as Dead Mountain to the people who live there, the Mansi people. The name alone is kind of ominous, right?
Yeah, it is.
So they set up camp, and that's when things start going wrong.
Yeah. So imagine, weeks go by, nobody's heard from the hikers. Searchers finally arrive. And what do they find? The tent's abandoned, ripped open from the inside like someone was desperate to get out.
Okay, that's creepy enough as it is.
Right, but then they start finding the bodies.
And the injuries. I've read about them. Pretty horrifying.
They really are. Some of them are close to the tent, others are further down the slope like they were running from something. And get this, some are barely dressed, barefoot, practically naked.
I've heard about the injuries. Fractured skulls, broken ribs. Some were even missing eyes and a tongue.
It's a gruesome scene. And the investigation didn't really help clear things up. The Soviets just said it was a compelling natural force. I mean, come on. What kind of natural force could cause all that and make these experienced hikers run out into the freezing cold night?
Yeah, that's where all the conspiracy theories come from, right? It's like the perfect breeding ground for speculation. Yetis, UFOs, secret military experiment.
Exactly. And if you think about the Cold War and how secretive the Soviet Union was, it kind of makes those theories seem a little more believable. People were already suspicious of what they were being told.
And then there's the radiation they found on some of the hikers' clothes. Was it some kind of nuclear accident, fallout from a weapons test, or did they stumble onto some top-secret military site?
It's definitely strange. But the radiation probably has to do with the hikers' jobs. One of them, Alexander Kolovetov, he worked at a place that developed nuclear materials. Another, Yuri Krivonychenko, worked at a plant that made plutonium.
So, no glowing Yetis then?
Probably not. But we can't rule out something else going on, something the authorities didn't want anyone to know.
We have a lot to talk about. The official story, which basically says nothing, and then all these alternative theories. Where do we even start?
Well, let's start with the most talked about theory, the avalanche hypothesis.
But an avalanche? How could that explain those terrible injuries and why the hikers would act the way they did?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It does seem simple at first, but the more you learn about this case, the more the avalanche theory doesn't quite fit.
Okay, I'm following you. Talk me through it. How could an avalanche have even happened there? And could it really have caused those injuries?
Well, some new research suggests it might have been what's called a delayed slab avalanche. So basically you have these strong winds, they call them katabatic winds, and they could have blown a ton of snow onto the slope above the tent, over a few hours. And remember, the hikers had actually cut into the slope to make a flat spot for their tent.
Right. I saw a diagram of that in one of the research papers. So they basically weakened the slope.
Exactly. That cut they made, plus this layer of weak snow underneath, they call it sugar snow, that created the perfect setup for a slab avalanche. Now, this isn't like your typical powder avalanche. It's this huge, solid chunk of snow that breaks off and comes sliding down.
So like a giant frozen battering ram hitting their tent in the middle of the night, that would explain the damage to the tent and maybe some of the injuries.
Yeah, for sure. But here's the thing that doesn't really add up. The bodies were found all over the mountain. Some were like a mile away from the tent, and some were barely dressed. A lot of the injuries just seem way too bad for just being swept down a slope.
You're talking about the broken ribs, the fractured skulls, the missing eyes and tongue. That's hard to explain with just an avalanche.
Exactly. And then there's the question of why they ran out into the freezing night with almost no clothes on. Why not try to dig themselves out of the snow or find some shelter?
So maybe the avalanche happened, but there's more to it. What are some of the other explanations people have come up with?
Well, some researchers think it could have been infrasound. It's this low-frequency sound wave that wind can create when it hits the landscape. It can make people feel anxious, uneasy, even cause hallucinations.
So maybe the infrasound, combined with the shock of the avalanche, made them panic and run.
That's one possibility. But even that doesn't explain everything. Like, why was there radiation on some of their clothes?
Right, we talked about that before. Maybe it was from their jobs at the nuclear facilities. But what if there's more to it than that? What if they saw something they weren't supposed to see?
Now we're getting into some interesting territory. Remember, the Soviet Union was doing a lot of secret military stuff back then, and the Ural Mountains were a perfect spot for it. What if they accidentally walked into a weapons test or stumbled upon a secret facility?
And the authorities covered it up, blaming it on some vague, natural force to avoid a scandal.
Exactly. And the radiation could be proof of that. And there's actually a pretty scary historical event that's kind of similar. The Kishtim disaster in 1957.
I've heard of that, but I don't know much about it.
It was a major nuclear accident at this plutonium plant, in the southern Urals, not too far from Dyatlov Pass. The Soviet government kept it a secret for years, denied it even happened, and they suppressed any info about, how it affected people's health.
So if they could cover something that big up, it's not hard to imagine they could do the same with an incident involving 9 hikers.
Right. Especially during the Cold War. Everyone was paranoid and secretive. They would have done anything to protect their secrets.
Okay, so we've got a possible cover-up, secret weapons, and radiation.
Yeah.
This is starting to sound less like a hiking trip gone wrong and more like a spy movie.
And we're just getting started. There are even wilder theories out there. Everything from Yetis to UFOs. I know it sounds crazy, but we gotta remember the official explanation doesn't make sense, and there are a lot of ways to interpret the evidence.
Okay, so we've talked about cover-ups, weapons testing, even some Cold War paranoia. But we can't ignore those, more out there theories, like the Yetis and UFOs. Is there anything to those? Or are people just letting their imaginations run wild?
Well, let's think about the Yeti idea for a second. The Ural Mountains are huge, really remote, and people have been telling stories about strange creatures there for centuries. Big, hairy, human-like figures.
Yeah, but stories aren't facts. Do we have any real proof that a Yeti was involved in this?
Well, no. There's never been any physical evidence. Like no footprints or hair samples that could actually prove a Yeti exists. But some people who believe this theory point to the injuries, the really bad chest injuries and missing, soft tissues. They say that could be from an attack by a big, strong creature.
I guess I can see how that would make people wonder. But wouldn't something that big leave some kind of trace? Footprints, broken branches, anything?
Yeah, that's the problem with the Yeti theory. There's no real evidence to support it. It's more about what we don't know than what we do know. I mean, just because we haven't found proof doesn't mean Yetis exist, but it doesn't mean they don't either.
Okay, so maybe Yetis are a bit of a stretch. What about UFOs? Weren't there reports of weird lights in the sky around the time this all happened?
Yeah, there were. Some people said they saw these glowing orbs or like streaks of light moving around in the sky really strangely, and that's led some to believe that maybe the hikers encountered something extraterrestrial.
I mean, if I saw something like that, especially in a place like that, so isolated, I'd be terrified.
Oh, absolutely. And remember, this was when the space race was just starting. People were really into the idea of space travel and aliens?
So maybe those lights were just Soviet rockets or satellites, and people just assumed they were UFOs because, that's what they were hoping to see.
That's a possibility. Or maybe it was just natural stuff like auroras or meteor showers that people mistook for something else.
So lots of interesting theories, but no real answers. It's amazing to me that even with all the science we have now, like the research on slab avalanches and computer models, people are still so captivated by the Dyatlov Pass incident.
It shows you how powerful a good mystery can be. We always want explanations. But sometimes, even when science gives us a good one, we're still drawn to the unknown, to the idea that maybe there's something more to it.
I think you're right. It's the mystery itself that keeps us coming back. We want to believe there's a solution, a real answer. But maybe the truth is much more complicated. Maybe we'll never really know for sure.
Maybe that's okay. Maybe the journey of trying to figure it out, looking at the evidence and thinking about all the possibilities, maybe that's more important than finding one single answer.
I think we've explored a lot of those possibilities today. We've talked about everything from the most likely scientific explanations to the really out there stuff. We looked at the evidence, thought about the historical context, and tried to imagine what those 9 hikers went through.
It's a powerful story. It reminds us how strong nature can be, how fragile life is, and just how much we still don't know.
And even in this day and age, with all our technology and science, there are still some mysteries that we may never solve.
That's true, but it doesn't mean we should stop looking for answers. Every new bit of information, every new way of looking at things, it gets us a little closer to understanding what happened, even if we never know the whole truth.
So what about you, listeners? What do you think happened on that mountain all those years ago?
Keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep your minds open. Until next time, deep divers.